Hello, I'm Fred Stewart, and this is my Come Unto Christ channel. This week, as we follow the Come Follow Me format, we're talking about Genesis chapters 24 through 27. This has been a difficult week for me, in that I have been reading and rereading this and just have had a terrible time really finding things about it that I really wanted to share with you. I think I finally have a couple of things we can talk about. And there are some real questions that I have had over the week as I've been looking at it, and I would like to spend some time sharing with you those questions and my thoughts on some of the things that happened here. If you're like me, you look at the Old Testament and many times wonder, what on earth were they thinking? Why on earth did this happen the way it did? And so I have some of those questions about this section. Let's begin, shall we? First, let me jump back in Genesis to chapter 23. In verse 1 of chapter 23, it says, "And Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died." Sarah lived to be 127, which means since she was 90 when Isaac was born, that would mean he was 37 when she died. Well, now, interestingly enough, that seemed to spur Abraham with the understanding that he better get a wife for Isaac, because I suppose maybe his mortality began to slap him in the face as well. So 3 years later, Isaac marries Rebekah, and of course the events of that are detailed in chapter 24, how Abraham sends his servant to find Rebekah, sends him back to the household of Sarah's family, because he didn't want Isaac to marry a daughter of the Canaanites. So that happened, and of course the story, you'll probably talk about that, and probably have talked about that already, about the servant going with the camels and going and finding Rebekah, getting water from the well, and her offering not only to give him a drink but also to water the camels. So we don't need to go into that. So let's go on from there. Interestingly enough, that meant that by the time the servant got back, it was about 430 years after the flood plus 432, 3 years after Sarah had died. And at the end of chapter 24, in that regard, it ends this way, verse 66, "And the servant told Isaac all things he had done, and Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." That's where we begin the story of Isaac and Rebekah. As we go on, I think it becomes, to me at least, rather evident that Isaac probably, as we say, married above his pay grade. Rebekah became a very faithful, very stalwart wife, and took care of things even later, as we'll see, when apparently Isaac was unable to. As we continue on into chapter 25, we find Abraham dies, and that's verse 7. "These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 163 years." So that would make it the flood plus 467 years. Verse 8, "Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died a good old age, an old man, full of years, and was gathered to his people." Verse 9 of chapter 25 said, "And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the caves of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, which was before Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth. There was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife." I honestly find it rather interesting that all his life, Abraham wandered back and forth, basically squatting in other people's lands, and accumulated much wealth, many camels and flocks and herds, and he didn't think it bad to take all his flocks and herds and all his servants and move into an area and use everything in the area, and then, I don't know what, move on? Is that what he did? I'm not sure. So, thinking about that, I went back to Genesis, the creation, and looked at, for example, Moses chapter 2, verse 27, where it says, "And I, God, created man in mine own image. In the image of mine only begotten created I him, male and female created I them. And I, God, blessed them and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And I, God, said unto the man, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which shall be fruit of the tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat." So, in my mind at least, if he's been given all the herbs and all the grains and all the foliage and all the trees, it makes sense that he would have to have possession of the land which those are growing upon. He would have to be a steward over the land over which his flocks and herds were grazing, the land where he was pitching his tent, and where this small miniature tent city was setting up. So it seems to me that having ownership of that land would be integral to maintaining his lifestyle, or his life in general. From other reading I've done, it seems that those ancient people believed that the land, the earth, was God's, and so they could not own the land, but just be stewards on it. That really doesn't make sense, does it? Wherever he went, there was striving with other people, so obviously they considered it their land, and he being the interloper. So why on earth did he not find his own land, since he had much gold and silver and wealth? And why did not he establish himself in his own land? I don't have an answer. If you have one, I'd love to have you send a comment. But anyway, let's go on from that question, because the same thing seemed to continue with Isaac and Rebekah. Okay, so we knew that Rebekah was brought back for Isaac, his wife, and verse 20 in chapter 25 said, "And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian, of Paddan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah conceived, and there were twins in her womb," it says. "And the first one came out red and all over in hairy garment." Now this is in verse 25. They called his name Esau. "And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare him." Well, so that means that's 20 years after they married, which makes it flood plus 452 years. This is interesting. It caused me, in fact, when I looked at this, to do a little bit of rough calculations, going back to Abraham when he left Ur of the Chaldees and began his journeyings in the land, which was about 292 years, according to books, since the flood. So now we're from 292 to 452 years, 160 years. And during this time, we have one heir to the priesthood. Now, why don't we have more? Well, interestingly enough, in chapter 25, after After Sarah died, Abraham remarried. He took a wife, and her name was Keturah. This is verse 1 in chapter 25. And she bare him, and they list 6 more sons. What did Abraham do with those 6 sons? Did they become a part of his family? Well, not really. They grew up, and he gave them gifts and sent him away and gave everything he had to Isaac. Now, I understand the idea of a birthright, and it was a big, big, big thing then, and for most of the history of the world it has been, honestly. But when you think of it, if you had 7 men all dedicated to building up the kingdom of God and dedicated to working together as a unit, how much more could they accomplish with their households than one? So here again, this is another one of those questions I have that there doesn't seem to be any answer to. Why was over and over again the same thing happened with Ishmael, and Abraham sent Ishmael and Hagar away. Obviously, they didn't go very far because Ishmael was still there with Isaac to bury Abraham. So they apparently didn't go very far and stayed in contact. And it talks about the sons of Ishmael and the 12 tribes according to their kings that came through Ishmael. So there were a great group of people there, but interestingly enough, because they did not have that precious birthright, they seemed to become not covenant people of the Lord. Now, why would this happen? I don't know. I don't know why it would happen. We have to just figure that out, I guess. We'll keep talking about that, though, and maybe we can get some answers somewhere. Let's go back to the days of Rachel and the birth of Jacob and Esau. As Jacob and Esau grew up, there was, again, friction over who was the eldest son. And Esau, of course, having that right, probably kind of took it for granted, became a hunter, and rather than growing things and staying home and growing, he liked to go out and hunt for what he wanted and bring it back. And so I suppose maybe as Isaac began to get a little older, the romance of the hunt and of having venison that Esau would bring back to him became a rather special thing to Isaac, and he kind of tended probably to favor Esau from the sound of things. But interestingly enough, something happened, and it's talked about in the end of chapter 25 that we don't understand very well. In chapter 25, where Esau came back from the field of hunting and had nothing, and he said he's faint. Therefore he said, Jacob, give me some of the pottage that you've made. And Jacob, I don't know, being a typical younger brother, says, no, go get your own. I don't know. And Esau says, well, I'm about to die. I'm going to die if I don't do it. Jacob says, well, sell me your birthright and you can have the pottage. I've always wondered about this, and here's why. If Jacob was making lentil soup or whatever it was, lentil stew or whatever pottage really was, that means he was at home. And at that place of their dwelling, there was also then Rachel and Isaac, and from what it sounds like, many, many servants, a whole household, people everywhere. So why did Esau have to get pottage from Jacob? There was nobody else he could get any food from? Doesn't really make sense, does it? So my conclusion here is that Esau really didn't care that he was the firstborn, and in fact, he was more interested in going out and having fun with his Canaanite friends, maybe, I don't know. Verse 34, the end of chapter 25, kind of indicates this a little bit. It says, then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So he didn't really care very much. Then in chapter 26, we have a famine again in the land, and the Lord told Isaac not to go down to Egypt, but to dwell where you're at. So he sojourned in this land, he says in verse 3 in chapter 26. And I will be with thee, and will bless thee, for unto thee and unto thy seed will I give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father. It says, I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of the heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall the nations of the earth be blessed. And Isaac dwelled in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him of his wife, and he said, She is my sister. Once again, it sounds like he felt threatened. And so when he was threatened, it was okay to lie. I can't understand that. To me, it doesn't make sense. He had a large household, a great deal of wealth. Why was he intimidated by the men of this city? Why hadn't he established his own place? Why didn't he have his own stronghold, if it will? I don't understand. If you understand, please send me a note. So anyway, you've read the rest of the story, how Abimelech, the king, sees Isaac sporting with Rebekah and says, no, she must be your wife. And why did you do this? We could have hurt you. We could have taken her, and you could have made a curse on all of us. And the presumption is, well, if she's my wife, they'll kill me to have her. But if she's my sister, everything's all right. Well, as long as they don't decide they want her, it's all right. Once again, the Old Testament seems to be full of questions, doesn't it? Anyway, so Isaac takes his wife and his stuff, and instead of staying on the land that is his, he moves up to another valley, and they start digging wells that had been filled in by the Philistines that Abraham had dug earlier. And every time they dig a well, the herdsmen of the area want that well, and so they continue to fight over it until he finally digs a well and says they don't try and take that one. So he says, okay, this is ours, and he names it. And let's look at the years again. In 452, Jacob and Esau is born. 492, in the end of chapter 26, he said Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. So this is back now when he was 40 years old. When Esau was 40 years old, Jacob was 40 years old as well. As we've looked at chapter 25, we've noticed that Abraham died 467 years after the flood. This is in chapter 25, verse 8. Abraham gave up the ghost at a good old age and died an old man, and has gathered his sons. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him. Abraham was around for much of the growing up years of Jacob and Esau. Then, 492, Esau marries the Hittite wives. We see verse 35 goes on, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. So at this point, the fact that not only had Esau sold his birthright, but then he married two Canaanite women, was a source of much concern and grief for Isaac and Rebekah. We see that played out again later in that chapter 27 then. This is the one that makes me think this really should be the story of Rebekah, not the story of Isaac. We just read that it was a great grief of mind to Isaac and to Rebekah, the dealings of Esau, and yet in chapter 27, Isaac calls Esau and says, go get some venison and make me savory meat and bring it to me that I can eat and then bless you. So Isaac at this point is intending to give the birthright blessing to Esau. And Rachel hears this and realizes that they had already talked about this and had struggled for years with this, which makes me think that not only was Isaac blind at this time, but he may have had dementia too, because he really did not even remember the problems that he'd had in the past and and the difficulties that had been among his family. So Rebekah worked it out so that Isaac got the birthright blessing in chapter 27. And then Esau came back and was aggrieved because he didn't get the blessing and wanted a blessing for himself, and he received a blessing. And as a result of these blessings, verse 41 in chapter 27, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father had blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will slay my brother Jacob. So after, what he's saying is after Isaac dies, he's going to kill Jacob and take everything. Interestingly enough, isn't that exactly what Cain said when he killed Abel? Now the flocks of my brother fall into my hands. We have here the same following of Satan that we originally saw with Cain and Abel, don't we? So when Rachel heard this, it says, verse 42, and the words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah, and she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said unto him, behold, thy brother Esau, as touching the death, doth comfort himself, proposing to kill thee. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise, flee thou unto Laban, my brother, in Haran, and tarry with him a few days until thy brother's fury turn away, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send and fetch thee from thence. Why should I deprive also of you both in one day? And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth, the wives of Esau. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these are the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do me? So, spurred by Rebekah and reminded of the problems, Isaac forbids Jacob to marry a Canaanite. He blesses Jacob and his seed with the blessing of Abraham. And this is in chapter 28. And we're going to go on into that next week. So we're not going to go a lot into that. But this is where Jacob is sent away. Apparently he was sent away and ended up forfeiting all of the riches that his father had because he apparently couldn't take much with him. I don't know. We'll talk more about that later. So we've covered these chapters looking at trying to make sense of what went on. And a lot of it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense based on our sensibilities today. I think then the thing we really have to do is remember that these people lived at a time when a different code of behavior was in place. Why that code of behavior was in place, that's a really valid question, I think, seeing as how everyone came from Noah and those three sons. They all should have been taught the same code of behavior. They should have been taught the same principles of righteousness. They had obviously strayed quite a ways from that. And it makes me wonder then why Abraham was sent into the land of the Canaanites instead of into another land. For example, from where he was at, he could have journeyed west and found France, southern France, or Spain, the fertile lands there that were there. He could have stayed up into the fertile lands around the edge of the Mediterranean Sea into what's now Turkey. And while that land is very mountainous, Israel's not exactly flat plains and fertile ground either. So it's interesting where the Lord sent Abraham. I wonder about why that is, and why I mentioned a little earlier the idea that in that 192 years, in that time from Abraham to Jacob, the other families and the other people probably had thousands and tens of thousands of people born to them. And yet the birthright lineage, the lineage of Abraham, has one. Why would the Lord do that, I wonder? This is total speculation. I don't know. But it seems to me that the Lord wanted the earth populated, but didn't necessarily want them all to be celestial candidates, if you will. So maybe when we look at it in that light, maybe we need to step back and think, well, apparently then, if we understood all that the Father understands, we would see the terrestrial kingdom and the telestial kingdom as being absolutely essential parts of eternity, not just a place where those who didn't make it to the celestial kingdom have to go. I've thought about that some in the past, and let me suggest that you give that some thought. Take a look at section 76 and section 84 and what it talks about concerning those things, and see what conclusions you come to. I'm quite confident there's an awful lot in the scriptures that we don't get from a surface perusal. That it's important to search the scriptures, to ask the Father questions for which there are no answers. Because if we don't ask questions for which we have no answer, we'll never have answers to questions that we don't now know. And you remember in Alma chapter 12, Alma points out that to some is given to know the mysteries of God. And those who are faithful receive more and more until they know all things. So are we faithful? Are we receiving more and more until we know all things? Or are we sitting back and being comfortable, just accepting the little we have and going through the same lesson every 4 years and not bothering to look beyond the surface? Well, that's up to you to decide what you should do. I believe the Lord will give us all things if we ask. But if we don't ask the question, He won't give us the answer. Let me suggest that as a way to proceed. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.